In the mid-1880s, the city of Austin, Texas was shaken by a string of brutal killings that would later be considered one of the first known cases of serial killing in the United States. Between December 30th, 1884 and December 24th, 1885, at least 8 people were killed by an unknown killer. Most of the victims were young black women working as domestic servants, and the media eventually began calling the unknown figure the Servant Girl Annihilator or the Midnight Assassin. The attacks followed a disturbing pattern. The killer struck at night, often while the victims were sleeping. Several were dragged from their beds and killed outdoors. The violence was extreme. Victims were beaten with axes or heavy objects, and many were mutilated after death. In at least one case, a sharp object was inserted into the victim's ear. Some of the victims' parents were also injured but survived. Among those killed were Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, and Gracie Vance. A few, like Rebecca Ramey, survived their injuries. The final 2 victims, Susan Hancock and 17-year-old Eula Phillips, were white women, and their deaths caused even greater public outrage. Despite hundreds of arrests and investigations, no one was ever convicted. James Phillips, Eula's husband, was tried for her killing but was eventually acquitted. One suspect, a ship's cook named Maurice, disappeared shortly before the killings ended, which raised suspicions, but nothing was ever proven. Some researchers have speculated that this killer might have traveled to London and re-emerged as Jack the Ripper, but there is no evidence to support that theory. To this day, the Servant Girl Annihilator's identity remains a mystery. In the late summer of 1888, the East End of London became the setting for one of the most infamous serial killer cases in history. The Whitechapel district, already struggling with poverty and overcrowding, was thrown into panic after a string of violent killings took place. Between August and November of that year, 5 women were killed in especially gruesome ways. These 5, known today as the Canonical 5, were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Each victim had their throat cut, followed by deep abdominal mutilations. Some investigators believe the killer had medical or surgical training because of how the organs were removed. The brutality and precision of the attacks led to a widespread manhunt, but the police were overwhelmed. Thousands of people were questioned, and countless leads were followed, but no suspect was ever arrested or charged. The name Jack the Ripper came from a letter sent to a London news agency, signed by someone claiming to be the killer. Most experts believe the letter was a hoax, but the name stuck, helping to build the killer's legend. Many suspects have been named over the years, including Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and George Chapman. In recent years, a researcher claimed to find DNA evidence linking Kosminski to one of the victims, but experts have raised questions about how the evidence was handled. Despite more than a century of speculation, the killer's identity remains unknown. For many, Jack the Ripper is not just a killer, but a symbol of how evil can hide in plain sight and how fear can grip an entire city when justice remains out of reach. Between 1887 and 1889, London faced a series of disturbing killings that became known as the Thames Torso Killings. These killings occurred during the same period as the Jack the Ripper case, but investigators quickly realized that the crimes followed a completely different pattern. Instead of slash wounds and mutilation of organs, the victims were dismembered with expert precision, and their body parts were scattered across different parts of the River Thames. The first case began in May 1887, when a human torso was discovered in Rainham. Over time, additional parts of the same body were found along the riverbank in locations such as Battersea. The head and upper chest were never recovered. Dr. Charles Calloway examined the remains and concluded that whoever committed the crime had clear anatomical knowledge. However, no suspect was ever arrested, and the victim was never identified. In 1888, during the height of the Ripper Panic, another torso appeared near the future site of Scotland Yard. This crime became known as the Whitehall Mystery. The dismemberment showed signs of careful technique. The police suspected the killer had experience handling bodies, possibly as a butcher or in the medical field. By June 1889, another body was discovered. This victim was eventually identified as Elizabeth Jackson, a homeless Irish woman who was pregnant at the time of her death. Dr. Charles Hebert later studied all 4 major cases and believed they were committed by the same person. Despite ongoing efforts, no one was ever charged. Most researchers today agree that this killer was not Jack the Ripper, but another hidden predator. The Thames torso killer remains one of the darkest and least understood figures in Victorian criminal history. Between 1918 and 1919, the city of New Orleans was gripped by fear as a series of violent home invasions left residents dead or seriously injured. The killer, later dubbed the Axeman of New Orleans, attacked at night, usually by chiseling out a panel on a back door, slipping inside, and then beating his victims with an axe or slashing them with a straight razor. In many cases, the weapon belonged to the victims themselves, often taken from their own homes. The first confirmed victims were Joseph and Catherine Maggio, killed in their bedroom on May 23, 1918. Both had their throats slit and skulls crushed. The razor used belonged to Joseph's brother, Andrew, who was briefly considered a suspect before being cleared. Other victims soon followed, including grocer Louis Basumer and his mistress Harriet Lowe, who survived the attack but later died in the hospital. Harriet accused Basumer of the crime before passing, but he was acquitted. More victims followed. Anna Schneider, pregnant at the time, survived her attack. Barber Joseph Romano was killed, and his nieces saw the attacker briefly before he fled. The Axeman also killed 2-year-old Mary Cortimilia during an attack on her family in Gretna, Louisiana. Then, in March 1919, a letter claiming to be from the Axeman was published in the local newspaper. The writer threatened more killings unless residents played jazz music in their homes on a specific night. That evening, the city was filled with music, and no one was attacked. Despite police efforts and multiple arrests, no one was ever convicted. The killer's identity remains unknown. The Axeman's crimes combine brutality, mystery, and a bizarre flair for showmanship, securing his place as one of the most terrifying and enigmatic serial killers in American history. In the 1930s, Cleveland, Ohio was haunted by a series of gruesome killings that remain unsolved to this day. The unknown killer, nicknamed the Cleveland Torso Killer, dismembered at least 12 victims, although some investigators believe the number could be as high as 20. The killer's trademark was terrifyingly specific. Victims were decapitated, often while still alive, and their torsos were stripped of any means of identification. It was as if the killer wanted to erase every trace of who these people once were. Most of the victims were drifters or people on the margins of society. The killings took place between 1935 and 1938, mostly in an area known as Kingsbury Run, a shantytown filled with homeless residents during the Great Depression. Police struggled to identify the remains because the killer not only removed heads and limbs, but also sometimes treated the bodies with chemicals to speed up decomposition. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the fact that even with multiple victims and mounting pressure, the killer always stayed one step ahead. Elliot Ness, the famous lawman who helped bring down Al Capone, was serving as Cleveland's safety director during the investigation. Despite burning down the shantytown in a desperate move to flush out the killer, Ness never found solid leads. One suspect, a doctor named Francis Sweeney, was linked through circumstantial evidence and failed polygraph tests. But because of his political connections and declining mental health, he was never charged. The killing stopped after his commitment to a psychiatric hospital, but the case remains officially unsolved. The Cleveland Torso Killer left behind more than bodies. He left behind questions, fear, and one of the most disturbing mysteries in American crime history. In the spring of 1946, the quiet twin cities of Texarkana, sitting on the border between Texas and Arkansas, were rocked by a series of brutal attacks that became known as the Moonlight Killings. The man responsible, dubbed the Phantom Killer, was never identified. He struck under the cover of night, targeting young couples parked in secluded areas. His attacks were spaced out between February and May, and by the time he vanished, 5 people had been killed and 3 others severely injured. What made the Phantom Killer especially terrifying was his unpredictability and cruelty. He wore a white mask with holes cut out for eyes, turning an already horrific scene into something out of a nightmare. His first known victim survived, but the attacks quickly escalated. In one case, a saxophone-playing teenage girl was found dead miles away from her car, with her instrument lying close by. Another couple was dragged from their vehicle and beaten. Some victims were shot point blank with a .32 caliber pistol. The police response was massive. The Texas Rangers, local law enforcement, and even FBI agents were brought in. Roadblocks were set up, curfews were enforced, and terrified residents began locking their doors at night for the first time. Despite over 400 suspects being questioned, no one was ever charged. One man, Yoel Swinney, was the prime suspect, but a lack of solid evidence meant he was never convicted. Decades later, the Phantom Killer's identity remains unknown. The mystery still casts a shadow over Texarkana, where the killings have become a permanent part of local history and folklore. In 2009, a woman walking her dog in Albuquerque, New Mexico, made a discovery that would expose one of America's most disturbing serial killing cases. The land she walked on was part of the West Mesa, an area where the desert met a growing city. What police uncovered was a hidden burial site containing the remains of 11 women and one unborn child. Most of the victims were Hispanic women who had vanished between 2001 and 2005. They were in their 20s or 30s, and many had struggled with drugs or had been involved in sex work. The case became known as the West Mesa Bone Collector. Investigators believed the killer used the underdeveloped land as a dumping ground. The area was isolated enough to avoid suspicion, yet close enough to Albuquerque to provide easy access. Satellite images later showed signs of disturbed earth, possibly from the burial process. However, by the time authorities investigated, construction projects had already altered much of the land. Despite years of investigation and several persons of interest, no one has ever been charged. One suspect, a man named Lorenzo Montoya, lived near the site and had a violent history with sex workers. He was killed in 2006 during a confrontation, and while he remains a strong possibility, police have not confirmed him as the killer. To this day, the case remains unsolved. It serves as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable people living on the margins can vanish without a trace, and how a serial killer can operate in plain sight when society stops paying attention. In the mid-1980s, Hawaii experienced its first known serial killer case. The Honolulu Strangler targeted women across the island of Oahu between 1985 and 1986. His crime shocked the peaceful island community and led to one of the largest manhunts in Hawaii's history. The first victim, Vicky Gale Purdy, disappeared in May 1985. Her body was later found near Kehehi Lagoon with her hands tied behind her back. Over the next year, 4 more women would be killed in a disturbingly similar fashion. Each victim was bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Most were found near freeways or bodies of water. All were women between the ages of 17 and 36, and most were last seen near bus stops at night. The killer seemed to operate with a chilling pattern, choosing vulnerable women and leaving almost no evidence behind. In 1986, the FBI was called in to develop a psychological profile. Authorities believed the killer was a local man, possibly familiar with law enforcement procedures. A suspect named Howard Gay became the main person of interest after he led police to a body before it was officially discovered. He fit the profile and failed a polygraph test, but there wasn't enough evidence to arrest or charge him. After 1986, the killing stopped, but the case remained open. Despite public pressure and extensive investigations, the Honolulu Strangler was never caught. His crimes remain officially unsolved. The case left a lasting impact on Hawaii's criminal justice system, prompting improvements in forensic procedures and public safety awareness. The New Bedford Highway Killer is one of America's most chilling unsolved serial killer cases, not just because of the brutality involved, but because it speaks to a larger issue of how certain lives are treated as disposable. Between 1988 and 1989, at least 9 women disappeared from the city of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Their bodies were later found dumped along highways, wooded areas, and rural routes surrounding the region. All the victims were women, most of whom had struggled with drug addiction or had been involved in sex work. This pattern led many to believe the killer was specifically targeting vulnerable women, possibly someone who moved in their social circles. The investigation at the time was one of the largest in Massachusetts history. Over 12,000 leads were followed, and multiple suspects were brought in, but no one was ever officially charged. One prominent suspect was a local man named Anthony DeGrazia, who had connections to several of the victims, but he died by taking his own life before any charges could be filed. Another was Kenneth Pontes, a former corrections officer, but he was eventually cleared. The lack of physical evidence combined with the transient nature of the victims' lives made solving the case extremely difficult. The killer's method of operation was chilling in its consistency. Victims were strangled or beaten, and their bodies were dumped near highways, suggesting the killer was familiar with the roads and comfortable operating in rural areas. Despite widespread media coverage and growing pressure from the public, the case remains unsolved to this day. Many believe the killer may have either left the area, been incarcerated for another crime, or even died. The New Bedford Highway Killer case continues to be a grim reminder of how easily society overlooks the safety of its most marginalized individuals. Between 1968 and 1969, Glasgow, Scotland was haunted by a figure known only as Bible John. Over the course of 13 months, 3 women were found killed after nights out at the Barrel Inn Ballroom. Each of them had been strangled with their own stockings. Their bodies were left in or near their homes, and all of them had been menstruating at the time of their death, a detail the killers seemed to fixate on. But what truly made this case chilling was the eerily specific profile witnesses provided. All 3 women had reportedly left the ballroom with a tall, red-haired man who quoted Bible verses and disapproved of married women visiting dance halls. This is how the nickname Bible John came to be. The last known victim, Helen Puttick, was seen sharing a taxi with the suspect and her sister. That sister later gave police a detailed description, which was used to create a sketch that became iconic in Scotland's true crime history. Despite one of the most intensive manhunts in Scottish history, Bible John was never caught. Over the years, speculation ran wild. One of the most discussed theories suggested Peter Tobin, a convicted Scottish serial killer, might have been Bible John. Tobin lived in Glasgow at the time and had a history of violence. However, no definitive link was ever proven. Today, the Bible John case stands out as one of Britain's most infamous unsolved serial killings. It also influenced police procedures in the UK, especially in how they handled cases involving repeated offenders and public tips. The lack of physical evidence and the killer's sudden disappearance have left the case shrouded in mystery. For many, Bible John represents the terrifying possibility that a killer can slip through the cracks and never be found. The Zodiac Killer is one of the most infamous and mysterious serial killers in American history. Operating mainly in Northern California between 1968 and 1969, the killer is confirmed to have killed at least 5 people, although he claimed to have killed 37. What made him especially disturbing was not just the violence, but the way he turned killing into a public game. He sent taunting letters, cryptic ciphers, and threats to newspapers, demanding they publish them or more people would die. The first known attacks were on couples parked in remote areas. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were shot dead near Vallejo in December 1968. Just months later, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Magoo were ambushed in a similar fashion. Magoo survived and gave a description of the attacker, which helped sketch out a suspect but never led to an arrest. The pattern of targeting couples would repeat several times, with survivors often left traumatized but unable to identify the killer. What truly set the Zodiac apart was his obsession with being known. He signed his letters with a symbol resembling a crosshair and often included coded messages. One of his ciphers, known as the 340-character cipher, wasn't fully solved until 2020. In it, he denied being afraid of the gas chamber, calling it a way to get to paradise faster. His arrogance showed no signs of stopping. Despite numerous suspects and extensive investigation, his identity has never been confirmed. For many, the Zodiac represents the ultimate taunt to justice, a killer who vanished without a trace, leaving behind puzzles that still haunt American true crime history. The Monster of Florence is one of Italy's most terrifying unsolved mysteries. Between 1968 and 1985, a series of brutal double homicides shook the hills surrounding Florence. The victims were always young couples who had driven out to secluded areas. They were shot with a .22 caliber Beretta pistol, and in the later killings, the female victims were mutilated with disturbing precision. The first killing linked to the monster occurred in 1968, although it wasn't connected to the rest until years later. Authorities initially thought the killer was a jealous husband, Stefano Melli, who confessed. But after similar killings continued while Melli was in prison, investigators realized something darker was at play. In total, the monster is believed to be responsible for at least 16 killings across 8 separate attacks. The case triggered one of the most extensive manhunts in Italian history. Police investigated hundreds of suspects, ranging from lone killers to organized cult members. The most controversial theory came from prosecutor Giuliano Magnini, who suspected the killings were tied to a satanic group with deep political and cultural ties. That angle received heavy criticism and eventually collapsed in court. Despite years of work, no one has been definitively identified as the monster of Florence. Several suspects were arrested and released due to lack of evidence. The gun used in the killings was never recovered. To this day, the monster's identity remains a mystery. What sets this case apart is the mix of forensic failure, wild conspiracy, and the psychological fear it cast over Tuscany. The Freeway Phantom is one of the most disturbing and unresolved serial killer cases in American history. Between April 1971 and September 1972, 6 young black girls between the ages of 10 and 18 were kidnapped, assaulted, and killed in Washington, D.C. Their bodies were later found along the sides of highways and roads, earning the killer the nickname the Freeway Phantom. All the victims were last seen in familiar neighborhoods, often just a short walk from home. Each crime scene carried chilling similarities. Victims were often found with their shoes missing, and most had signs of sexual assault. In one of the most disturbing details, a note was discovered in the pocket of 13-year-old Brenda Crockett, believed to be dictated by the killer himself. It read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can." The handwriting seemed forced, almost as if someone was trying to disguise their natural style. The Washington Metropolitan Police investigated hundreds of leads, and even brought in the FBI, but no one was ever arrested. The case eventually went cold despite efforts from multiple agencies. To this day, the Freeway Phantom case remains unsolved, a source of deep pain for the families, and a haunting reminder of how systemic neglect can affect vulnerable communities. Many believe the case received less attention due to the victims being young black girls. Over 50 years later, the mystery still stands as one of the nation's darkest and most frustrating unsolved serial killings. Between 1974 and 1975, San Francisco was the scene of a disturbing series of killings that would later be linked to an unidentified figure known only as the Doodler. The nickname came from witness accounts and surviving victims, who reported that the man would often sketch or doodle his targets before initiating conversation. These weren't just quick drawings. Some described him as an artist with a calm, engaging manner, who used art as a way to lure his victims in. The Doodler is believed to have killed at least 5 men, and possibly up to 16, though authorities could never confirm the exact number. All known victims were gay men, which led investigators to believe the killer specifically targeted the LGBTQ+ community. Each body was found in or around the Ocean Beach and Golden Gate Park areas. The method was consistent. Victims were stabbed multiple times, often with signs of overkill, indicating a personal or emotional motivation behind the violence. Several men survived attacks and gave similar descriptions of a black man in his early 20s, slender and often soft-spoken. One even agreed to go to the police but refused to testify, fearing public exposure due to his sexuality. At the time, homophobia was widespread, and many potential witnesses chose silence over risking their safety or reputation. Despite having a suspect in custody in 1976, police could not move forward due to the lack of witness cooperation. The case eventually went cold. It wasn't until 2019 that the San Francisco Police Department reopened the investigation, offering a $100,000 reward for information and releasing new composite sketches based on modern forensic input. The Doodler remains unidentified to this day. He is a chilling example of how societal stigma can allow predators to escape justice. In 1982, a mysterious serial killer began stalking the Midwest, targeting small businesses near Interstate 70. Over a short period, 6 people were killed in cold blood across Indiana, Missouri, and Kansas. All victims were store clerks, working alone during the daytime. 5 were women, and the only male victim is believed to have been mistaken for a woman due to his long hair. Each was shot execution style in the back of the head, using a .22 caliber Irma Werk ET-22 pistol, a rare German handgun. Despite similarities across the crimes, the killer took only small amounts of money from the scenes. The first confirmed victim, Robin Fuldauer, 26, was found dead at a Payless Shoe Source, Indianapolis. 3 days later, Patricia Magers, 32, and Patricia Smith, 23, were both killed inside a bridal shop in Wichita. A customer nearly walked in on the attack and later gave police a description of the suspect, which led to a composite sketch. The spree continued with Michael McCone in Terre Haute, Nancy Kitzmiller in St. Charles, and Sarah Blessing in Raytown. Each were killed in broad daylight with no signs of struggle. Police noted that all the stories were close to I-70 and all seemed like targets of opportunity. Although some investigators believe later killings in Texas and other parts of Indiana could be linked, no solid connection has ever been confirmed. Witnesses described the suspect as a white male, between 5'7" and 6 feet tall, with reddish or light brown hair. Decades later, the I-70 killer remains a complete mystery. Despite a dedicated task force, open reward offers, and new forensic reviews, he has never been caught. The case stands as one of the most chilling unsolved serial killer sprees in American history. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the mysterious serial killers I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.